The morning light filtered weakly through the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the polished wood floor. It was supposed to be a routine hearing, a procedural debate about immigration enforcement policies, little more than a formality. Tom Homan sat quietly at the witness table, papers neatly stacked in front of him, his expression calm and measured. He had been here before, testifying, defending, explaining. It was nothing new, but there was something different in the air today. An undercurrent, a tension just beneath the surface, humming like a power line stretched too tight. The presiding judge, known for his sharp tongue and disdain for immigration officials, shuffled his notes with theatrical impatience. His reputation preceded him, a man who believed the courtroom was his stage and humiliation was his preferred weapon. And today, it seemed, he had chosen Tom Homan as his target. As Homan adjusted his tie and prepared to answer a basic procedural question, the judge leaned forward, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Mr. Homan," the judge said, his tone dripping with mock sympathy, "would you mind explaining your qualifications to the court? In simple terms, of course, I imagine. Constitutional law was not part of your training." A ripple moved through the courtroom, half laughter, half gasp. The judge was not asking a question. He was setting a trap, baiting a reaction. Would Homan take the insult? Would he bristle and fight back? Would he stumble into a war of egos, with a man holding the gavel? Homan blinked slowly, his face betraying nothing. But across the gallery, observers leaned forward in their seats, sensing that the air had shifted, that something more than a legal debate was brewing. Was the judge's arrogance about to backfire? Was Tom Homan really the easy target he seemed to believe? Could years of field leadership, tactical decisions, and battles against political machines have prepared Homan for a moment exactly like this? The judge pressed on, emboldened by the murmurs around him. "Perhaps," he added, his voice heavy with mockery, "you can help us understand your deep grasp of the Fourth Amendment. You know, the one about unreasonable searches and seizures?" The condescension hung thick in the room. Court clerks shifted uncomfortably. Even the opposing counsel raised an eyebrow, wondering if the judge had gone too far. Why had the hearing turned personal so quickly? Was it really about the Constitution, or about crushing a man who dared to defend unpopular policies with unwavering resolve? For the first time since the proceedings began, Tom Homan moved. He placed his pen down carefully, folded his hands on the table, and looked directly at the judge. Not defiantly, not angrily, but with the calm confidence of someone who had been through storms far worse than this. The tension crackled like dry leaves underfoot. The audience held their breath. Would Homan take the bait? Would he let pride drag him into a shouting match? Or did he have something far more devastating in mind? As the judge waited, half smirking, ready to deliver another barbed jab, Tom Homan began to speak. And with the first few measured words, it became clear. The judge had gravely miscalculated. Tom Homan's voice was steady, unwavering, cutting through the tension that had wrapped the courtroom in a suffocating grip. "Your Honor," he began, his words measured and deliberate, "I'm happy to answer your question, but I'd like to make sure we're clear on one thing before we proceed." The judge's smirk faltered just slightly, his eyes narrowing as he leaned forward, expecting some form of defiance, some crack in Homan's otherwise calm demeanor. Instead, what he got was a direct, professional response, one that commanded the room's attention, drawing all eyes away from the spectacle and back to the man at the center of it. "I've spent more than 30 years enforcing the laws of this country," Homan continued, his voice cool but with an edge of authority that had commanded respect from the highest levels of government. "I've served under multiple administrations, faced legal challenges from every side, and managed some of the most complicated cases you can imagine. So if you're asking me whether I understand the Fourth Amendment, Your Honor, the answer is yes." The judge's expression tightened. For a brief moment it seemed as though he had underestimated the man sitting before him. Had he believed Homan would fold under pressure or become flustered in front of the public. Was this what he had hoped for? A quick win on the basis of a quick jab? But instead of the confrontation he had sought, Homan simply looked at him with quiet resolve, and the atmosphere in the room shifted. It wasn't an arrogant deflection. It wasn't an attack. It was simply a man stating a fact that, by all rights, should have been respected. The courtroom was dead silent. The opposing counsel, who had been bracing for a more contentious exchange, shifted nervously in their chair. They hadn't expected Homan to come back with such poise. What had started as a casual insult now seemed to be a test of wills, and the judge was beginning to realize just how unwise it was to try and break this man with cheap mockery. But the judge, never one to back down from a challenge, cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the moment. He wasn't ready to admit defeat. Not in front of a full courtroom. Not after trying to publicly diminish Homan. "So," the judge began, his voice a touch more defensive, "if you understand the Constitution so well, why have you repeatedly pushed for policies that some would argue violate citizens' rights?" The question, though framed as a legitimate inquiry, was laced with intent, an attempt to force Homan into a corner, to make him justify decisions that were never meant to be questioned. On the witness stand. This time, Homan didn't flinch. He simply sat back in his chair and looked around the room for a moment, his eyes sweeping over the gallery, making sure every person there knew he wasn't just talking to the judge. He was speaking to all of them. "Because," he said slowly, his words deliberate, "sometimes we have to make difficult choices. The law isn't always about what's easy. It's about what keeps people safe. It's about doing the right thing, even when it's unpopular. Especially when it's unpopular." The judge's jaw tightened. He had heard this argument before, but hearing it from Homan, the very man whose decisions had become a lightning rod for controversy, struck a chord that made the judge uncomfortable. The room seemed to hold its breath once more. Homan continued, not giving the judge the satisfaction of a direct confrontation. Instead, he raised his gaze higher, speaking with the same calm confidence, but now with an undeniable edge of authority. "We have to stop pretending that every decision is just black and white," Homan said, his tone softening just a fraction. "We have to face the reality that enforcing the law is messy. It's imperfect, but it's necessary. And sometimes, when you're responsible for keeping a country safe, you don't have the luxury of catering to the most popular opinion. You do what's needed." The room was still. Even the judge, momentarily taken aback, couldn't seem to find a response that could effectively challenge Homan's logic. And in that moment, something happened that no one had expected. The courtroom, which had been primed for a spectacle of mockery and insults, was now entirely silent. Everyone, from the judge to the gallery to the defense attorneys, left with the question hanging in the air. Was the judge prepared to continue this mockery? Or was he starting to realize that Tom Homan had just shown him something far more valuable than any cheap jab or clever retort? The judge sat back in his chair, momentarily taken aback by the clarity and weight of Homan's words. The smirk that had once adorned his face was gone, replaced by a subtle tightness around his eyes. There was a shift in the room, a change in the atmosphere that could not be ignored. The tension had transformed from a playful back and forth into something far more serious, something that no one had expected when the day began. As the judge cleared his throat and shuffled his papers, it became clear that his earlier attempt to belittle Homan had not only failed but had backfired spectacularly. The gallery, once full of whispered laughter and judgment, was now eerily quiet, their attention focused entirely on the unfolding exchange. It was as if they were all waiting for the judge to acknowledge his misstep, to admit that he had underestimated the man in front of him, but the judge, refusing to concede so easily, pressed forward. His voice was lower now, tinged with a hint of irritation. "So, Mr. Homan, are you suggesting that the law should bend to your interpretation of what is necessary?" that it is okay to disregard constitutional rights if you believe it serves a greater purpose? Homan didn't hesitate. He had known this question would come. He had been prepared for it. The idea that he would let the judge frame the debate was laughable. Instead, he answered with the same level of calm authority he had carried throughout the entire hearing. "No, Your Honor," he said, his eyes never leaving the judge's. "What I'm suggesting is that the law should be upheld correctly. There is a difference between disregarding rights and enforcing the law in a way that ensures the protection of those very rights. You can't protect the rights of citizens if you allow the law to be broken by people who are trying to exploit the system. That's the reality." The room was still. Homan's words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of truth, and for the first time the judge seemed unsure of how to proceed. He had expected a fight, a quick rebuttal he could easily dismantle, but what he had received instead was a solid, well-thought-out defense, a defense that called into question his own reasoning. The opposing counsel, who had been looking for any opportunity to jump in, seemed reluctant to engage. They could see the shift in the room. The momentum had swung in Homan's favor, and their window to capitalize on the situation was rapidly closing. Outside the courtroom, the news of the clash was already starting to spread. Journalists were beginning to tweet about the confrontation. Bloggers were writing about the unexpected turn of events, and commentators were rushing to air. The public was shocked. They had anticipated a courtroom drama, but they had not expected this. A highly trained, battle-hardened former law enforcement official, standing toe-to-toe with a judge and outsmarting him at his own game. As the moments passed and the judge hesitated, it became apparent that Homan had the upper hand. His demeanor was calm, but beneath the surface there was a sharpness to his words that cut through the judge's facade of control. And it was clear to everyone in the room that the judge's earlier attempt at mockery had been exposed for what it was: an ill-conceived, reckless jab that had only served to reveal the cracks in his own authority. The courtroom, which had been on the brink of chaos, was now poised in a strange, tense silence. Homan had proven his point. He had done more than simply respond to the judge's attacks. He had flipped the script. And in doing so, he had left everyone, including the judge, reconsidering their assumptions about who was in control. For the first time, the judge seemed to falter, his carefully crafted image of authority beginning to crack. He was now in a position where his next move could either salvage the situation or cement his embarrassment. But what would he do? Would he double down on his ridicule, or would he take the opportunity to recover, perhaps even admitting he had underestimated Homan? The question hung in the air, unanswered. And as the seconds ticked by, the courtroom waited, collectively holding its breath for what would happen next. The judge, visibly flustered, leaned forward again, trying to reassert some control over the situation. His hands, which had once moved with the precision of a man accustomed to power, now fumbled slightly as he reached for his notes. He was searching for something, anything, that could help him regain his footing. But the confidence he had once exuded had been replaced by uncertainty, and in that moment he was no longer the commanding presence in the room. "I see," the judge said, his voice now lacking the authority it once had. "So, you would have us believe that the law is simply about your interpretation of safety?" Homan's response was immediate, cutting through the judge's feeble attempt at recovery. "No, Your Honor," he said, his voice unwavering. "It's about upholding the law as it is written. It's about ensuring that people who come to this country do so legally, that they respect the rules set in place for their own safety and for the safety of others." The courtroom was silent. This wasn't just a legal argument anymore. It was a battle of wills. The judge, caught off guard by Homan's calm yet commanding presence, was now playing catch-up, desperately trying to regain control of a situation that had spiraled far beyond his expectations. It was clear that this was no longer about whether Homan had the right to enforce immigration policies. It was about something deeper. something fundamental about the nature of authority, respect, and the rule of law. And for the first time the judge realized that the man sitting before him wasn't just a target for mockery. He was a force to be reckoned with. "Let's not pretend that this is about anything other than politics," the judge said, his voice edged with frustration. "Your policies are divisive. They're harmful. They put people at risk." But Homan was unshaken. He had heard it all before. He had spent his career navigating the murky waters of political debate, where accusations were hurled and principles were twisted. He had never let the noise drown out his sense of duty, and he wasn't about to start now. "Your Honor," Homan said, his voice gaining strength, "it's not about politics. It's about protecting this country. It's about enforcing laws that keep Americans safe, while also ensuring that those who enter our country do so legally. It's about upholding the integrity of our system, no matter how unpopular it may be." For a moment the judge sat there, his face pale, his eyes searching for a counterpoint, but finding none. He had hoped to discredit Homan, to expose him as a mere pawn in a political game. Instead, he had been forced to confront a man who not only believed in his mission, but had the legal expertise to back it up. The audience, who had been watching the exchange unfold, seemed to sense the shift. They had come for the spectacle, for the drama, but now they were witnessing something far more significant: a clash of ideologies, a battle for the soul of the nation, unfolding in real time. The courtroom, once filled with tension and uncertainty, had now become a battleground of ideas. And Tom Homan was no longer just a witness in the case. He was a symbol of something larger, something that had the power to alter the course of the nation's future. As the judge opened his mouth to respond, the room held its collective breath. What would he say next? Would he concede, admitting that Homan had bested him in this legal battle, or would he attempt another desperate attack, knowing full well that this was his last chance to salvage his dignity? But the moment never came. Instead, the judge paused. And in that silence, it was clear that something had changed. The judge had underestimated Tom Homan, and now he was forced to reckon with the fact that he was no longer in control of the narrative. Homan had turned the tables, and the courtroom could no longer ignore it. The judge's face hardened, but it was clear that the wind had been knocked out of him. His usual air of superiority, his ability to dominate the room with mere words, was gone. For the first time in this hearing, he seemed unsure of himself. His hands, once steady and precise, now trembled slightly as he shuffled his papers. The moment of doubt was palpable, and it wasn't just the judge who felt it. The entire courtroom sensed the shift. Tom Homan, however, remained calm. The fire had not dimmed in his eyes. It had only grown brighter. He had faced far more intense pressure than this. Political opponents, media attacks, and courtroom battles had all been mere stepping stones, leading him to this singular, defining moment. He wasn't intimidated by the judge's attempts at humiliation. And as the judge faltered, Homan's clarity only seemed to shine brighter. The judge finally spoke again, his voice now clipped and defensive. "You think you have all the answers, don't you, Mr. Homan? You think you know what's best for this country. But what about the lives you've affected? The families you've torn apart? What about the damage your policies have caused?" The words were sharp, desperate. A final attempt to strike back, to reclaim some semblance of power in the face of Homan's relentless composure. But Homan was unbowed. He had heard these accusations many times before, and they no longer carried the sting they once did. He had learned long ago that those who shouted the loudest were often the least willing to listen. "I've never claimed to have all the answers," Homan responded, his voice steady but firm. "But I've always believed in the principles of the law. I believe in keeping people safe, in protecting this country. And yes, sometimes that means making tough decisions. But if we lose sight of those principles, if we allow our emotions to cloud our judgment, we lose everything." The room was silent once again, the weight of his words settling over the courtroom like a heavy blanket. There were no retorts, no quick comebacks from the judge, just silence. The judge, now completely deflated, appeared to consider his next words carefully. For the first time that day, it seemed as though he had realized the futility of trying to break Homan. The audience in the gallery, who had been holding their breath throughout the entire ordeal, seemed to release a collective sigh. The tension in the room began to dissipate, replaced by a strange sense of resolution. Tom Homan had not only survived the judge's mockery, he had turned it into a moment of victory. The courtroom had witnessed the unraveling of a man who thought he could easily dismiss a seasoned, experienced public servant. But now, the tables had turned. The judge cleared his throat one last time, but it was clear that any attempt at further confrontation would be futile. His eyes darted briefly across the room, as if seeking some kind of support, but the audience's gaze was fixed firmly on Homan. There was no backing out now. "Very well," the judge said, his voice now lacking the bite it once had. "We will continue the hearing. But Mr. Homan," he added, his tone softer, "this is not the last time we will meet." Homan didn't flinch. He simply nodded, his face a portrait of calm. "I'm sure it won't be, Your Honor." With that, the judge, no longer the towering figure of authority, called the hearing to an end. The room slowly began to empty, the buzz of conversation rising as people filed out. Some exchanged whispers about what they had just witnessed, about how a simple mockery had turned into a dramatic public defeat for the judge, and how Tom Homan had proven that sometimes the greatest strength comes from remaining steadfast and unshaken. Outside the courtroom, news outlets were already picking up the story, speculating on the fallout. It had started as a routine hearing, a chance for the judge to make a quick mockery of a controversial figure, but instead, it had turned into a spectacle that no one would soon forget. Homan had not only held his ground, he had stood tall and forced the judge to reckon with the truth in front of an entire audience. And though the battle had taken place within the confines of a courtroom, its reverberations were felt far beyond those walls. In that moment, Tom Homan had proven something important, not just to the judge, but to the entire nation. Standing by your principles, no matter the odds, is what defines true strength.